This video traces how a single missile shot validated an entire military doctrine. We'll walk through the radar systems, tactics, and the split-second decisions behind the Sea Harrier's first air-to-air kill, and show how that moment justified the aircraft's long-term evolution into the FA-2, now AMRAAM capable. Watching this story unfold, you'll see how one engagement refined what agility, radar awareness, and adaptability meant in naval air combat. The Sea Harrier began life not as an apex fighter, but as a reluctant concession to political and fiscal reality. Britain's 1966 Defense Review marked a fundamental reduction in naval aviation ambition. The intention was to retire large fleet carriers, such as Ark Royal and Victorious, and rely instead on smaller vessels that were termed through-deck cruisers. These Invincible-class ships carried the silhouette of a cruiser, yet functioned as reduced-size carriers, with decks roughly half the length of their predecessors. They were designed for anti-submarine warfare first, combat air patrol second. The immediate consequence was clear: no catapults, no arresting gear, and therefore no way to operate fast jets designed for conventional takeoff or recovery. That technical constraint forced the solution toward vertical and short takeoff capability. It was not a stylistic preference, but a structural necessity driven by deck geometry and budgetary arithmetic. The engines that made it possible, the Rolls-Royce Pegasus, used vectored thrust, redirecting exhaust through swiveling nozzles that could lift or propel the aircraft. The system worked in wind tunnel trials and controlled prototypes on land, but its naval adaptation presented new concerns about deck heating, exhaust ingestion, and the rate at which sorties could be generated from a limited surface area. A traditional carrier could launch multiple aircraft every few minutes using a steam catapult system. The Invincible class, by comparison, supported far fewer concurrent launches, and its radar horizon was dramatically smaller. In numerical terms, the British deck measured little more than 170 meters, whereas American fleet carriers extended beyond 300. The smaller sensors and fewer airborne assets meant reduced coverage against incoming aircraft or missile threats. Strategically, this was a voluntary downgrade, accepted under the belief that Britain would operate within coalition frameworks rather than independently projecting power. The Americans, maintaining supercarriers throughout the 1970s, continued fielding supersonic fighters like the F-14 and the F-4, all designed to intercept at long range. Britain's light deck ships could not, so the Maritime Air Wing had to be rethought for economy rather than reach. The concept of a jump jet, taking off with minimal roll and landing vertically, fit within that constraint. By this point, enthusiasm was limited even inside the British services. Royal Air Force officials doubted the vertical flight concept could ever yield a convincing air defense platform. Subsonic performance and narrow fuel margins seemed incompatible with modern interception. The Harrier's political defense thus relied on its declared versatility, able to strike ground targets, conduct reconnaissance, and defend the fleet, all from a single frame. Each of these missions provided an alibi for its retention during repeated funding reviews. It entered service as an empirical trial more than a mature doctrine. Every operational deployment became an instrument test, the proof that Britain could still field naval fixed-wing aviation without owning a full-sized carrier. That fragile foundation would be challenged just over a decade later, when a crisis in the South Atlantic required the same aircraft to demonstrate, under combat pressure, that compromise could still equate to victory. The Harrier's very existence embodied Britain's post-imperial balancing act, a nation determined to project power with shrinking resources, relying on innovation to compensate for diminished scale. Engineers had designed it to operate from short decks and forward bases, a concept born out of necessity rather than luxury. Pilots trained relentlessly to master vertical takeoff and landing, turning what once seemed a technological curiosity into a battlefield advantage. Each sortie in peacetime was an investment in proof, an assertion that flexibility could substitute for size. When the Falklands War began, Britain's two Invincible-class carriers embarked barely 20 operational Sea Harrier FRS.1s. They faced an Argentine force fielding more than 80 fast jets, among them Mirage IIIs and Mirage V daggers capable of sustained supersonic flight. The ratio alone made air superiority seem unlikely, and the Sea Harrier's entry into combat under those conditions amounted to a high-stakes verification of its entire design philosophy. What followed became one of the most studied case studies in modern air warfare, a demonstration of how superior tactics, pilot training, and radar-guided missiles could offset technological and numerical disadvantage. The aircraft's Blue Fox radar, primitive by modern standards, proved capable of early detection over the cold South Atlantic waters, while its subsonic agility allowed tight turns that confounded enemy intercepts. In the brutal mathematics of aerial combat, performance and preparation met necessity, and improbably prevailed. The operating environment worsened those odds. Long transit legs from the carrier task group to the islands stretched fuel margins to minutes, not tens of minutes. The South Atlantic weather routinely produced low, layered cloud that hid aircraft until visual range and scattered radar returns. On top of that, radar coverage from shipborne sensors was incomplete. Detection relied on limited cueing from surface controllers and whatever the Blue Fox radar could find through precipitation. In such conditions, speed no longer guaranteed victory, but situational control still depended on coordination that had to work through radio delay and unreliable radar echoes. Harrier pilots quickly learned that an intercept could not be pursued purely through energy advantage. The FRS-1's top speed was several hundred knots below that of its opponents, so the only sustainable path was to fight for geometry rather than velocity. By coordinating their movements through precise vectoring from the carrier controls, pairs of aircraft flew intercept patterns that emphasized altitude positions and blind triangles in the enemy's sensor coverage. The geometry produced fleeting firing windows only a few seconds long, but these were enough if both pilots executed symmetrically. Out of this constraint emerged what crews labeled the hook maneuver. In a typical scenario, the lead aircraft charged head-on at the oncoming formation, broadcasting itself on radar and visually, while the wingman peeled away and turned back underneath at low level. The Mirage pilots, concentrating on the decoy, climbed or turned offensively without realizing that a second Harrier was now approaching from the rear quarter. Each side depended on radar data to interpret where threats might be, and the Mirage's system, optimized for high-speed frontal intercepts, struggled to distinguish small, slow contacts approaching from below under thick cloud. The engagement on the 1st of May 1982 confirmed the method's effectiveness. After multiple failed merges, a pair of Sea Harriers were again vectored by the HMS Glamorgan toward two Mirage III EEAs, trying to withdraw south. The lead pilot held their attention long enough for his wingman to reach an offset position. When the Mirages finally reversed to attack, the wingman achieved a short-range sidewinder lock, firing into their turn and destroying one aircraft outright. It was the Royal Navy's first carrier-based air-to-air kill since the Second World War, and proof that agility, radar assistance, and disciplined teamwork could offset raw speed. The same characteristics that had once been criticized, the aircraft's subsonic handling, its double-span control authority, and radar tuned for sea clutter resistance, became operational strengths. Operating within the margins of limited endurance, every sortie demonstrated that control and awareness, not velocity, determined survival, laying the groundwork for how the fleet would rethink air defense after the conflict. That first confirmed Mirage kill was more than a single engagement. It signaled a doctrinal shift. Within days, the carrier air group began running their combat air patrols further forward, trusting the Blue Fox radar integration and the Sidewinder's high off-bore sight response to handle threats beyond what the earlier planning had allowed. Pilots who had begun the campaign expecting only localized defense soon adopted continuous armed reconnaissance patterns, intercepting Argentine strike packages at greater distances and lower altitudes, where the Harrier's agility mattered most. Confidence in their radar and missile pairing produced a more aggressive operational rhythm, each sortie crossing the thin margin of endurance that had once restrained planners. Even so, skepticism behind the scenes persisted. Defense accountants and design consultants argued that the Harrier's results, though impressive, occurred in unusually favorable conditions. Short engagements and isolated contacts, rather than sustained fleet defense against massed raids. They doubted the STOL approach could ever support the tempo of modern interception duties. The Sea Harrier's wartime record forced those same officials to re-examine those doubts. Its 20 confirmed air-to-air victories, achieved without a single loss in aerial combat, overturned this assumption that subsonic speed limited survivability. For the Navy, that dataset replaced conjecture with evidence, and in procurement terms, evidence outweighed every theoretical shortfall. Post-war evaluation turned anecdote into engineering guidance. Maintenance logs showed high radar reliability despite salt exposure, while after-action debriefs revealed that pilots were approaching workload saturation when juggling radar scanning, missile queuing, and fuel management. Engineers used that data to justify a new generation of avionics integration for what became the FA2 standard. The upgrade concentrated on a pulse Doppler solution, designated Blue Vixen, that combined look-down capability with resistance to clutter and jamming. This pulse Doppler principle measured Doppler shift rather than raw return amplitude, allowing detection of low-flying targets through background reflection, a leap that multiplied situational range far beyond the Blue Fox's limited search cone. The FA2's integration of the AMRAAM missile completed the conceptual transition. Instead of the tight, visually confirmed merges of 1982, interceptions could begin tens of miles away, guided by radar command and independent missile tracking. The Harrier platform, once deemed marginal, now matched the reach of larger NATO fighters for most maritime threats. In raw performance terms, the new radar extended practical detection envelopes dramatically. Where the earlier system might glimpse a fast-moving contact with modest range bands, the updated set could manage full multi-track engagements while retaining high reliability under sea-level conditions. As a result, the argument that small carriers could not deliver credible air power weakened. Technical success compensated for absent tonnage. Britain's assumption that large-deck carriers were obsolete, once viewed as a strategic flaw, was temporarily resolved, not through policy correction, but through empirical proof that precision engineering and refined tactics could meet global standards. The Harrier, redesigned under tight fiscal constraint, therefore bridged two eras of fleet defense, linking the minimalism of the Invincible class with the emerging expectation of multi-role naval air power that would carry forward into the 1990s and beyond. The Sea Harrier's first air-to-air kill converted a fragile concept into a verified doctrine. A design once justified by budget constraints became the foundation for Britain's renewed carrier aviation strategy. That single engagement provided measurable proof that agility and advanced avionics could offset speed deficits. Subsequent combat reports verified those findings and secured long-term investment in upgrades like pulse Doppler radar and AMRAAM integration. What began as an experimental measure endured as policy, bringing Cold War carrier tactics with modern fleet defense principles. Such validation by combat remains a persistent force, shaping technological development wherever theory collides with operational necessity.